Welcome to the Patient Podcast, a series of conversations with innovators, HR leaders, and benefit advisors about how they're solving benefit challenges and building healthier communities by helping people access and afford healthcare. Hi, I'm Laura Cave, and Crystal Breck joins me today to welcome Joel Wood, President of the Council for Insurance Agents and Brokers. He has been the top regulatory and government affairs officer at the Council since 1993. He came to Washington a decade earlier to work as a press and legislative director on Capitol Hill. Chris, I know that you and Joel have known each other for years, and you've had a chance to connect not too long ago at CIAB's annual conference. As a longtime friend and colleague of Joel's, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about Joel's special genius as a way of introduction.
Yeah, yes, and I'm going to hold him off from saying anything until I'm done because I know how he's going to react to that, as he is kind of shy in that regard. But no, it's two things. One, and I don't think everybody knows this, but Joel has a penchant for these expressions that just roll out every once in a while, and I've actually written a bunch of them down. They make me chuckle, they make me think, and I don't know where that comes from, but it is brilliant. The other is. And it's something I learned about Joel in my first study group up in DC at the council was the level of influence that he has with our legislators, as does the council. I see him rolling his eyes. I get that, but it's true. I mean, I remember sitting in front of him. There was a book about this thick and a small pamphlet about this thick, and he's talking for about 25 minutes. I finally said, Joel, what's with the two books? And he said, this is the amount of people that are trying to influence this group of legislators, the small pamphlet that we have access to. And the amount of influence the council exhibits, while they're not even in the top 10 lobby money spent in DC, is tremendous. And a lot of that comes from Joel and just his authenticity, the way he approaches that relationship building. So those are the two things that I've recognized. And he's just a great guy.
I am totally going on the website, revising my resume. I am a special genius. I am.
There you go. There you go.
You know, Chris, the feelings are mutual. So, Chris, for those of you who don't know, obviously great depth in the benefits business and the brokerage space. You guys are blessed to have him, but was a member and a very valuable member of our Council of Employee Benefits Executives, sort of our benefits arm. If you look at our organization, Laura, we've got about 170 member firms, but in the commercial property casualty space, and this includes the global brokerages, that's over 90% of premiums that are placed through our member firms, either the brokers for or the consultants to. And about 2/3 of their revenue is commercial property casualty, 1/3 on the benefit side. And certainly we have some shops that are much more heavily weighted on benefits. But I found in my 30 plus years being with this organization, it seems like we spend 2/3 of our time and our legislative efforts on the benefits front, because that's just frankly where the existential threats lie, as opposed to commercial property casualty. So great organization and great folks to work with, like Chris, and great to get to know the patient community now that you guys have joined us as partners at our meetings. And I'm really excited about the products you offer and the enthusiasm for them, and how they can help solve a lot of problems, not only for our brokers, but for, tens of thousands of Americans.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're going to definitely dig into all of that. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm going to do this in the future, make our guests introduce each other. This is so fun.
So I've got special genius. I invented polyurethane and the weed eater. I was the grand marshal of the Rose Bowl parade. You missed a lot of this stuff. Bronze star with an oak leaf cluster for valor in the first Persian Gulf War. I mean, all right.
He bakes award-winning brownies, and he can ice sculpt with a chainsaw. The guy's amazing.
Awesome. Well, let's get into it. So, Joel, I wondered if we could start out by having you share a little bit about how you found your way to the CIAB in your career and what really excites you about your role there today.
Thanks so much. Very, very much like the majority of folks in our world, in the benefits world, in the consulting broker world. I came in through the side door, not the front door. I had a very typical path towards being a lobbyist in Washington, insofar as I had a member of Congress who was elected in 1982 from my hometown of Memphis, invited me to come up. I was a newspaper reporter, and he invited me to come up as his press secretary. Then I became his legislative director. Then I left Capitol Hill for the first good lobbying spot. It happened to be in the insurance industry, and I found myself at this organization 5 years after that. It's the thing that's exciting about now, 30 years as a lobbyist and 6 months as the president, so still very much in a transition. The thing that's great, I know it sounds a little self-serving about our association, is I like representing the marketplace winners. That we have some extraordinary executives. We all know the mergers and acquisitions environment, and we all know with the inflation environment, the healthcare environment, and the hard commercial insurance marketplace, there are a lot of really dynamic things that are going on, and our member firms are solving a lot of problems for tens of millions of Americans. So it's a great spot to be, a great perch to be in, and I'm blessed to have not only members that are really civically minded and active and have can help me connect the dots on Capitol Hill. They've given me all the resources that we need. We've got the largest political action committee by far in the insurance industry, and the top 5 nationally among business groups. So we've been blessed on that front. It's a great group.
Yeah. So interesting for me this year to have experienced the EBLF conference in Colorado Springs from the other side, right? So I've always been a broker, and for the last 5 or 6 years been on the CB board. It seemed to me, and maybe you and I just had an offline conversation about my good friend Andy Veeder, maybe it's a lot of his leadership, part of his leadership, and the board seemed extremely focused, and the event seemed extremely focused on affordability and access. So leading into the meeting itself, what were some of those conversations that's driving that and pushing that and bubbling that up to the top?
Thank you. Yeah, Andy Veeder, he's with MJ Insurance, and he's a great leader of our organization. And look, there's a lot of anxiety. This is, and it's ongoing anxiety. I think, one survey I saw this week said that healthcare costs are expected to rise another 6% in 2023. I mean, I get comparatively is not as bad as previous years, but one of the global brokers this week said 7 out of 10 employers are anticipating significant increases in their healthcare costs over the next 3 years or so. And so budgeting is just becoming very challenging. And I think our penultimate rationale for being is that the preservation of the employer-provided group health insurance marketplace. And I think that employers already think, them much better than me, Chris, but they already think that their healthcare costs are on an unsustainable trajectory. And so COVID, I think, caused employers to avoid introducing too much change during an uncertain period. And now people are just turning their attention towards the benefits. What can we do to make life easier for customers? That's why I think the product that you guys offer in the environment of higher and higher out-of-pocket expenses for individual consumers is so welcome in the marketplace today.
Yeah. So I would liken it almost to, for this conversation, it's politics, right? Politics gets to a certain point where you think people can't behave this way. It can't continue to go that way. And then it becomes normalized the following year and goes another step. The rate increases, the unsustainability over the period of the last just 20 years, but exponentially worse every single year. I don't know how it gets normalized, and the end user's under such pressure.
Having survived a lot of these battles over the ACA undoubtedly, created access for tens of millions of Americans to healthcare. That's not under contest. However, it's almost like a false summit. And from here, it just so from an access standpoint, that's met. But in terms of bending the healthcare cost curve, it only gets steeper as we go. And we all know the kinds of things that are necessary to bring down the cost of healthcare. But, they're very difficult politically. I mean, obesity, end-of-life issues, overutilization of specialists, self-referrals to specialists, the ever-escalating cost of specialty drugs, the lack of transparency in pharmacy benefits. These are all very, very difficult things. And, When you mentioned that prop that I sometimes use of the Washington Representatives book filled with the tens of thousands of people like me that are trying to influence what just those 435 House members and 100 Senate members are going to do. Every one of those 55,000 registered lobbyists has something at stake in healthcare. And so, unlike commercial property casualty issues where we can really move the dial inside the Senate Banking Committee or the House Financial Services Committee, we win some, we lose some, we wash out on some. It's very difficult to move that dial in healthcare when everyone has constituent interests in it.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you really have your finger on the pulse of this conversation. I'm wondering if you can kind of share with us what you think from the country's best thinkers, what are they saying that can actually improve access and affordability? And which of those ideas is really viable right now?
Given the polarization, frankly, it was a pretty good time for me to move off of being the day in, day out lobbyist and into broader roles here with our trade association, because there's just, the polarization. And now that we've got divided government with a House of Representatives with the, Republicans just barely holding on, we're not going to see major, short of some black swan moment, not going to see major legislation emerging. I think the most substantial thing that's occurred in the Biden administration was the expansion of the access inside the exchanges. Now people making up to 700 families making up to 750% the federal poverty line do have access to some degree of subsidies inside the exchanges. In terms of the big picture stuff, I think that everybody agrees conceptually on this, and all the great thinkers talk about healthcare cost transparency, but it's, the devil is in the details. For us, this probably isn't the grand answer to all of our ills, but we're very focused on transparency. The brokerage community, we cooperated with Congress in 2020 in the Comprehensive Consolidated Appropriations Act 2020 that basically took the old Form 5500 reporting requirements on broker compensation that were retroactive for ERISA plans and made them prospective. And so we're brokerage firms, they're being completely transparent. Now, it's been a torturous process. There hasn't been enforcement on this yet by the Labor Department, but we've got sort of a toolkit for our member firms to use. But this was designed for the entirety of the healthcare ecosystem. And the PBMs have said that it doesn't apply to them. And so for us, in the prescription drug space, there's just not an easy way to follow how money, services, incentives flow through the pharmacy supply chain. There's so many side deals, or the rebate aggregators who negotiate rebates with drug manufacturers on behalf of PBMs or plan sponsors and hold the contracts. They retain unknown portions of those rebates as profits. PBM-owned pharmacies, PBM-owned group purchasing organizations that aggregate purchasing volume. There's so many aspects of it, and we think that transparency should fall there. Now, what they say is that, particularly with the big three that control more than 80% of the marketplace, that if they have to disclose these, that's their special sauce for how they would lower prices. Well, brokers are revealing what their special sauce is as well. Everybody's got a different business model. And so we just think that is something that's really the biggest thing that Congress is actively debating now. And there seems to be sentiment both across the philosophical spectrum that we want to try to get there. But they're very, very big, important interests. And the way that we're not a parliamentary democracy, the way that Madison created government, it's always easier to beat something than it is to pass something. And, on my floor of the building that I'm in right now on 7th and Pennsylvania Avenue, is one of those three big PBMs, and they've got an army of folks that are trying to fight that. But that's something that we are really focused on. It's just healthcare price cost transparency.
Yeah, to unpack that a little bit further, I do. I think that was a bit of an open kimono moment for the broker community, right? I remember back in 2017 in DC when we had these conversations about, what would it look like if we started to step into the position of fiduciary as brokers, and I think that was part of the conversation. It was more around transparency. I think it's really important too, Joel, to recognize the fact that all parties are stepping into that role, right? So carriers, providers, brokers, all of the folks that are kind of, and to varying degrees at first, right? But I think it's going to lead towards a better situation. So knowing that you can carve ice sculptures, you're the head of the Rose Bowl parade, and you bake award-winning brownies. Now I'm going to ask you to put your predictive hat on. We're going into an election cycle. And as concerning as it is entertaining, I'm going to ask you, knowing we were talking about transparency in 2017, we're starting to see it now. Look forward into 2025, 2026, not knowing what's going to happen with the election. What are the reasons for optimism? What do you feel? Where do you feel there's going to be a break or a change? No black swan moments, but a migration maybe towards something better. What does that look like for you and for your council members?
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me specific questions as to what's going to happen next year, because inside the Beltway, Washington conventional wisdom is always wrong. So I could give you my opinions on it, but I know that I would have to, there are 10,000 news cycles between now and the election next year. On the healthcare front, I think I'd like to think that at a certain point, members of Congress are going to want to try to work cooperatively. And I think that, in the post-ACA environment, we've, I think many of the core issues really are not liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat. There are some things on which, the single payer types of arguments of gravitating in that direction. And honestly, I don't worry about a vibrant public option, for example, that Joe Biden had proposed. There's not going to be 60 votes in the Senate for something like that, or moving toward a single payer system. So there's all kinds of stuff coming at it from the left that it's not going to happen. Neither party is going to control 60 votes in the Senate, and you would have to have a Democratic wipeout. Democrats wiping out Republicans next year for those things on the left to occur. Similarly, we face struggles with conservatives. Paul Ryan's was the most articulate spokesperson for this purist version of consumerism, wherein you blow up the employer-provided group health insurance marketplace, you eliminate any tax incentives. The number one tax expenditure in the tax code, that is the amount of money that you would make if you eliminated a tax break, is the exception from taxation for group health insurance benefits. Number two is 401ks, and that's and it's a way bigger number than the charitable deduction tax breaks or the home mortgage interest deduction. And a lot of very philosophical conservatives think that we should end those tax breaks. So, and that always sort of remains a threat. But there's a huge gap between that purist version of consumerism, and I get the theology on consumer driven, that whole notion that until we as Americans start asking our docs, how much is that MRI you're sending me across the hallway to get cost compared to what I can go shopping for 5 miles from now? I get that. But if you think that we've got a problem 11 years after the enactment of the ACA, with tens of millions of uninsured Americans, just blow up the employer-provided group marketplace, which is 174 million Americans, and see where we are then. So there's a huge gulf in there, and there are a lot more practical members of Congress than you would think who would like to try to resolve things. And that's why I think transparency, there's nothing inherently liberal or conservative about transparency in healthcare pricing. I think that there's some other access related issues, and I think one of the big things that we've got to get a handle on, or it's just the ever increasing cost of specialty drugs.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I've always enjoyed talking to you about. You kind of level set for me, because if I watch the news, I never really, these people are not spoken about the things that they're truly doing. a lot of that conversation doesn't happen. So you always give a fresh view of these. This isn't partisan. These are what people are trying to solve for, which I think the audience needs to hear. They're not that close to it, right? And the
But
influence.
the thing about it is, and forgive me for interrupting, Chris, but the thing about it is that everybody wants to go to heaven and nobody wants to die.
See what I said, Laura? It's exactly what I told
There
you.
it is.
If you look at the ACA, which did so much on the access front, but in terms of bending the healthcare cost curve, there was one provision in the ACA that would have theoretically at least bent the healthcare cost. And it was very controversial, the Independent Payments Advisory Commission that was passed as a part of the ACA. That became the death panels. And not even President Obama, for his 6 remaining years, never even moved to fill those spots there. These are really difficult things, on making decisions about, potentially what is government willing to pay for? And, and I can argue it both ways, but at the end of the day, these are really tough calls. And that's why I'm not overly optimistic about, we're going to have, substantial major reforms that have a dramatic impact. But I do think that we can sort of move towards moderation with a number of measures that are primarily transparency related.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, because we have the idea of heaven, right? The idea that a consumer can afford and understand and have a participation in the care that they consume, its price, its quality, and be an active participant in those choices. Yet they have not been able to see the prices. It's sort of like asking people to be consumers and go into a store and buy something where they don't know what anything costs and they don't have any money.
Yeah.
And there is no store. So it's sort of like,
Yeah.
how is that supposed to work? So the transparency piece is vital. And I think there's so much work to be done, even in the private sector, on how do we productize these experiences? How do we make these raw output of prices make sense? And how do we make them purchasable in a way that would make sense to a layperson, a family? So that's, I think, going to be an exciting area of innovation, and where we've come in on as patient is really thinking through, how do we put people in a position to be able to pay for something that is unpredicted and in some cases still an unknown amount.
Absolutely.
And to date, we've been trying to do that with actual money, with cash. Contributed to HSAs. We've made that pre-tax, which is all really well and good. But if you can't afford to save, or the organization can't afford, in the face of crippling price increases, to continue putting cash into accounts equally for everyone, knowing that only 30% of the group is even going to consume care this year, we just feel like there's got to be a less expensive, more effective way to put people in a position to be able to pay for care. And that's why Patient as a brand stands for the power to pay. So I'm wondering, as you've kind of heard from Chris and gotten to know our solution, like, how do you think about Patient in a moment like this, in this context, in the market and in our legislative situation?
Well, I mean, employees can use the card to get care with health systems, facilities, and physician groups, and which I think helps. It helps underscore. It helps buck up the employer community, and and insured patients are just going to. I think it goes to the heart of the affordability issue from an individual consumer standpoint, that actually reinforces the employer provided group health insurance marketplace. And I know that I talk so much about transparency, but I do think the other element I didn't mention is all these machine readable files that are now becoming available from providers.
Yeah.
There are a lot of barriers to accessibility to those files right now, just
That's right.
because it's, they're so massive, and there's not, but we're really early in that process. And I think that there is an opportunity to unlock a lot of data-driven insights for employer clients, so that we do get a better handle on ultimate costs. And there are ways to fix the data. and standardization of terminology, for example, and making sure that payers include a conversion of their prices, that since they're not all expressed in the same way. But that's something that I think that you're going to see play out. And again, we're very early in this process, but I tend to not be sky is falling on that the way many of the provider groups have said that they would be. And I think we're going to get a better insight into pricing in a way that ultimately can hopefully control pricing in the coming 2 or 3 years.
That's
Machine
right.
readable files like MERS, right? MRFs. Like we needed another 3-letter acronym in our business, like another hole in the head. But I mean, they may as well were written in Sanskrit when they first came out. But there are some very smart people and some outfits out there that are going to make some sense of that. When you think about patient, obviously we're scratching an itch with nearly 800,000 members on platform in a very short period of time. It's clear that there's a need out there and there's enough wage compression. Our average swipe is $132 as of this past month. So it's not a $500 expense. That's average. There are people that are swiping to finance $75, $50 because that's the pressure that they're under. So it's validating. But I think the arc is, when you start marrying that into the ability to influence towards and provide guidance and navigation towards lowest cost, best medical outcome, it becomes a pretty powerful place when you're serving the end user like that. So, and everybody experiences this. You mentioned it earlier. In many ways, healthcare is not bipartisan because everyone is touched by it. It's unlike the property and casualty world where some are not. But what's interesting to me as I think about how we all experience this, I know you do as well, right? So you and your family, and you have a charity that is very near and dear to your heart that we'd love to hear more about, because you showing your experience in that space, and then where you sit next to a legislator, you can speak from your own world, and everyone kind of shares in that. So tell us a little bit about your charity, Joe. Let us know.
I'm touched that you would raise it, and I appreciate it. So it's everyone has no one whose family members have not been touched by the disease world. Mine has been pretty stark in that my now 25-year-old son, James, at the age of 2 in the year 2000, was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's the line I always used is that it was the nation's #1 lethal childhood genetic disorder. Genetic, however, not hereditary in our case or in most cases. And he hasn't walked in 14, 15 years, and he's, pretty dramatic impact. It's a single gene that produces a protein that helps bind muscle cell walls together. And so he is, but he's, when he was diagnosed at the age of 2, there was, it was considered sort of a hopeless disorder. We didn't have any private investment, virtually no government investment. And so a lot of what I do is just sort of not only pass the tin cup for our charity, which is called the Foundation to Eradicate Duchenne, or the Fed, to try to chase authorization legislation at NIH and other places. But the thing that's, so what's the connection between my world as a lobbyist for the employee benefits consultancy industry and as a parent? One story I will say, and I don't have a firm conclusion on this, but it does demonstrate the complexity. So we sort of make a deal with the devil when you got a kid with this disease. If you want to keep him alive, when he was diagnosed in 2000, 85% of the kids did not live to be 20 years old. So he's 25 now. He's still going to college and still doing fireball shots at the frat house and doing pretty well on all things considered. But the deal with the devil that we make is we jack these kids up on corticosteroids. When you think about prednisone, it's been out there for 75 years, and a nickel a pill. And it has terrible side effects. I lost count of the number of bones that my son has broken, for example. So I'd heard anecdotally about 17, 18 years ago about an alternative corticosteroid available for a different indication in Europe. And anecdotally, people seem to think that it was, did a lot better than prednisone, and it had far fewer side effects. So I am blessed to have the resources. So I had a prescription made for me and got it through London and paid $5,000 or $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year to ship it in. Meanwhile, a little small biotech out of Chicago decides, this is really intriguing. Let's roll the dice. Let's do some trials. Let's see if this actually is a better drug that has far fewer side effects. And so, because it was an existing drug, it didn't take 12 years and $1 billion, but they invested $150 million over a 5-year period of time, and they proved that it was better for the kids, and it was had far fewer side effects, and it was approved by the FDA, and therefore it is now illegal for me to get that drug abroad because it is an FDA-approved drug. And all this is wonderful. Now thousands of kids can get their docs to write a script out for the right drug for them. Price tag, $88,000 a year. That's the list on that one. Just in the last week, 1 week ago, as of this taping, the FDA approved the first ever gene therapy drug for Duchenne. Now it's only going to be available for 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, and it's not the big magical fix, but it did get approved, and it's sort of the first step in gene therapy for hopefully all of these kids, including my own. Price tag on that one, $3.2 million. So it's all wonderful, but wow. And that's where the incentive system is for people to invest in orphan diseases like my own kids. So sorry, that's a long explanation, but it does bring us home to why this is so seemingly intractable.
Yeah, I almost have no words for that. I mean, it's astonishing. And I've seen some of the other gene therapy drugs. There's one out there, I think the per pill, $850,000. I mean, that's just, it's like, yes, there's something out there, but it's unattainable. So you can't have it, right? I mean, that is very unfortunate, but a real story.
It's interesting though how it all plays out. So what happens is, most of the parents, it's based on most of the parents put their kids on Medicaid because it's based on their income, not the parents' income. Most state Medicaid plans will pay for that drug that my son is on, whereas my principal insurer through my employer says, we'll pay for prednisone. It's a nickel a pill, but we're not going to pay for this. But then in the balance, the companies, they all create patient assistance plans. If you look at like a dozen of the top 20 charities in America are actually patient assistance plans, as opposed to, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's like AbbVie's patient assistance plan, where that's Humira. So what do? They if Medicaid doesn't pay for it, and if her primary insurance doesn't pay for it, they create a patient assistance plan, and they get to take a deduction based on the list price of the drug. And so people do wind up getting it. It's just that we all wind up paying for it. And again, I'm not arguing against that. It's just incredibly complex.
I mean, this just goes to show how much innovation is required to try to find ways to make all of this work. And I'm so glad that you're sitting there kind of at the center of so many of these issues to try to push those conversations forward. I think it's tremendously important and certainly very personal for you and so many other families.
Well, I try to always live by the rule that the foot you step on today is connected to the ass you got to kiss tomorrow. So
there's another one.
On that note. Oh, Joel, it's been so wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspective. Just incredibly valuable to have you with us and sharing all of these insights with our listeners. So,
Laura, it's been a pleasure to meet you. Look forward to seeing you in person. Chris, I'm so grateful you're continuing on as a member of our family and so excited for what your company is.
Yeah, so very grateful for your friendship and partnership over the years, Joel, and for joining us today for certain. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Laura Cave, and this has been the Patient Podcast. If you'd like to share feedback or contact us directly about this episode or any other, drop us a note at podcast@patient.com. That's podcast@PAYTIENT.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.